At 6:30 on a cool spring evening in April 1937, the light over northwest Washington, D.C. had turned the brick houses along Massachusetts Avenue a soft, almost golden red. A black sedan from the Japanese embassy rolled to a stop at the curb outside what an American State Department official cheerfully described as a small house, just a modest place in the capital's growing residential belt. For the young Japanese diplomat in the back seat, the word small did not match what he saw. The house rose 2 full stories above a finished basement, with a deep front porch, a sloping lawn, and enough width to hold what looked like several large rooms side by side. To his eyes, shaped by the crowded districts of Tokyo and Yokohama, where families squeezed into tight plots and wooden dwellings leaned into each other along narrow streets, this modest home looked enormous. This was not a battlefield in the usual sense. There were no tanks, no artillery, no infantry charging across an open field. But for men like him, sent by Tokyo to watch, measure, and understand the United States in the years before war, these evenings in American living rooms were a different kind of front line. They were quiet, carpeted, softly lit places where the scale of American life revealed itself, one small house at a time. He understood that the stakes were larger than a dinner invitation. Behind the easy smiles and polite conversation, he was expected to see the shape of a nation's power, its wealth, its space, its confidence in building homes this large and calling them ordinary. Years later, when bombs fell across the Pacific and cities burned, memories of these Washington rooms would haunt some of the men who had walked through them. They had seen how big small could be in America, and how little that fact had been understood back in Tokyo. A young man from a crowded country, the diplomat we will follow tonight, was not one of the famous names who shaped Japanese policy in the crisis years before Pearl Harbor. His name rarely appears in English-language histories, and even in Japanese records he is more of a shadow than a headline. We will call him Hiroshi, an educated, careful man in his early 30s. Part of a generation that had watched Japan race from semi-feudal society to modern industrial state in just a few decades. Hiroshi had grown up in a provincial town on the edge of a growing city. His childhood memories were of narrow streets, wooden houses pressed close together, and small interiors made flexible by sliding doors and bedding that could be rolled and stored away. His family was not poor, but like most Japanese families between the Meiji and Taisho eras, they lived compactly. Space was precious, and rooms served more than one purpose. In school, Hiroshi had been bookish, small-framed, slightly under average height, with thin shoulders and a habit of listening more than speaking. He had studied English from a young age, first from dry textbooks, later from the occasional foreign teacher brought in to prepare promising students for a world in which Japan could no longer stand apart. By the time he entered the universities of the 1920s, he moved in a Japan that considered itself modern. Electric trams rattled through city streets, factories poured smoke into the sky, and Western-style brick and stone buildings began to appear in city centers. But home life, even in these modernizing cities, remained compact by Western standards. The typical Japanese dwelling reserved its sense of beauty for efficient use of space, careful carpentry, sliding partitions, small gardens fitted into narrow courtyards. Rooms could become dining spaces, sleeping quarters, or reception rooms within minutes, simply by shifting cushions, tables, or bedding. When Hiroshi passed the demanding examinations for the Foreign Service, he entered a small, elite world. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, based in Tokyo, sent only a few dozen men abroad at any one time. Most had been educated at elite institutions and trained to observe not only formal policy, but something more subtle, how people in other countries actually lived. By the mid-1930s, with tensions rising in both Asia and Europe, Washington, D.C. was one of the most important postings a Japanese diplomat could draw. The United States was not yet the world-spanning superpower it would become after 1945, but it was already a nation of vast territory, industrial output, and rising global influence. Japan's leaders, increasingly drawn toward military solutions in Asia, still needed to know how far they could push before the United States would resist. Hiroshi was sent to help answer that question, not on battlefields, but at desks, meetings, and dinner tables. When he received his posting orders for Washington, he imagined grand official buildings, ornate halls, stiff receptions. He did not imagine that the memories which would stay with him most vividly were of houses, single-family dwellings in which American families lived, laughed, argued, and slept, under roofs that could have covered 2 or 3 Japanese homes. A mission of observation. By the time Hiroshi arrived, the Japanese government had already established a substantial presence in the American capital. The official embassy compound, designed in the early 1930s by American architects for the Japanese government, stood along Massachusetts Avenue, a broad, tree-lined boulevard that would later be known as Embassy Row. Unlike many embassies that occupied repurposed mansions, the Japanese complex was built specifically for diplomatic use, with a large Georgian Revival residence and, eventually, additional buildings and even a tea house set into a landscaped garden. To Hiroshi, the embassy itself was an intriguing hybrid. The main residence looked outwardly American, brick walls, a symmetrical facade, classical proportions. But inside, along with the long central hall and formal sitting rooms, there were touches designed to make Japanese officials feel at home, a careful sense of proportion, spaces that could hold both Western furniture and Japanese decoration, and, in later years, a tea house that brought a fragment of home into foreign soil. His workday followed a predictable pattern. He translated cables, drafted reports, attended meetings, and occasionally accompanied senior diplomats to calls at the State Department or other embassies. There he watched Americans at work, officials in spacious offices, corridors wide enough to drive a cart through, buildings standing alone on their own plots rather than pressed shoulder to shoulder. But it was in the evenings and on weekends, when American acquaintances invited embassy staff into their homes, that another set of observations began to form in his mind. Washington in the interwar years grew outward, not upward. New neighborhoods of detached houses spread north and west, stretching into previously wooded land and open fields. These houses were not palaces. They were described in real estate advertisements and casual conversation as small, modest, or starter homes, places where young civil servants, officers, and professionals began their family lives. The word small caught at Hiroshi's ear repeatedly. In Japanese cities, especially older districts, space had always been at a premium. Land was scarce, plots were narrow, and houses often seemed to lean into each other as if to share their burdens. In rural villages, homes might sit on a bit more land, but they rarely spread sideways in the way American houses did. They extended their lives through multi-generational use and careful internal division, not ever-increasing floor area. In the United States, where total land area dwarfed Japan and population density was far lower, a different logic prevailed. By the 1930s and 1940s, the average floor area of new single-family homes already exceeded 1,000 square feet, and trends were moving towards still larger dwellings in the decades to come. Much later, research would show that American homes tended to be roughly twice the size of Japanese ones on average. But for Hiroshi, these numbers had not yet been written down. He measured the difference in footsteps, how long it took to walk from one end of a hallway to another, how many rooms lay between the front door and the kitchen, how many people could sit in a single living room without feeling crowded. The embassy's official mission was diplomacy, but unofficially, men like Hiroshi were expected to be human measuring devices, reading the scale of American life in every visit. How were houses heated? How many people lived in them? What sort of possessions did a normal family own? These questions mattered because they hinted at what kind of strain the United States could bear if a crisis came. One evening in a small house that April evening in 1937, Hiroshi accompanied a senior colleague to the home of an American official whose name would never make front-page news. The address was somewhere north of DuPont Circle, in a neighborhood that had grown as the capital's professional class expanded. The sedan rolled along smooth streets lined with rows of detached houses, each standing on its own rectangular plot separated by strips of lawn and trees. The American host, standing at the front door, greeted them with easy formality. He apologized not for the food or the lateness of the hour, but for the house. It was, he said with an embarrassed smile, nothing fancy, just a small place. Hiroshi followed his colleagues up the steps and into a front hall that, by Tokyo standards, could have held the main room of his childhood home 3 times over. The living room had high ceilings and wide windows. A fireplace, currently cold, dominated one wall. Two large sofas and multiple armchairs sat in the middle of the room, leaving generous aisles for people to move around without brushing against furniture. Bookshelves lined a second wall, and a heavy wooden dining table was visible through an archway beyond. As the evening unfolded, Hiroshi did what he always did at such gatherings. He listened carefully to the conversation, trade figures, naval treaties, speculation about Europe, talk of elections and committee hearings. All the while, some quiet part of his mind took measurements: the number of electric lights in the room, the thickness of the carpets, the presence of a separate dining room, a separate kitchen, a separate study. He noticed that the host's two children, both still in school, each had their own bedroom upstairs. This, too, was part of the mission. American statistics were one thing: tables of production, shipbuilding, steel output. But those numbers lived here in these spaces, in the assumption that a normal family would have a house this big and call it small, that each child might expect a private room. That storage space would be given over to unused items simply because there was room to keep them. Back home, average Japanese houses remained much smaller, even as cities modernized. Rooms were shared. Space-saving features like built-in storage, sliding partitions, and multi-use rooms allowed families to live in less area. In many ways, Japanese domestic architecture turned necessity into art, treating smallness as an opportunity for refinement. But sitting in that Washington living room, Hiroshi felt the weight of difference. Smallness here meant something else entirely. It meant that America, as a society, could afford more square footage, more possessions, more separation between family members. It meant that the baseline comfort of its middle class stood at a level far above what most Japanese citizens knew, and it hinted at something harder to quantify: the reserves of space, material, and psychological expectation that might come into play if the country ever shifted to a war footing. Quiet comparisons and unheeded warnings. Over the next several years, Hiroshi visited many such homes. Some were indeed larger than that first house: broad column structures with multiple bathrooms, guest rooms, even rooms dedicated to nothing more than reading or music. Others were more modest bungalows or row houses, especially in older parts of the city. But again and again, he heard the same phrase: just a small place. He kept a discreet notebook. Officially, it contained work-related notes, summaries of conversations, impressions of personalities, small details that might matter in future negotiations. Unofficially, between those lines, he recorded fragments of the domestic world he saw: 3 bedrooms plus study, finished basement, 2-car garage, separate guest room. Small house, host said. Back in the embassy, in the long hall that ran the length of the main residence, he sometimes compared impressions with other staff. Military attachés who spent their days counting ships and calculating range and tonnage had their own version of the same experience. They toured industrial plants, shipyards, and training bases, and many came away uneasy at the scale they saw. Yet within the Japanese system, which by the late 1930s was increasingly dominated by expansionist officers and nationalist politicians, such impressions did not always find a receptive audience. Historians later noted that a persistent underestimation of American capacity and resolve ran through many pre-war Japanese assessments. There were exceptions, voices that warned of the industrial and material strength visible behind America's sometimes isolationist rhetoric. But to men far from Washington, trying to balance domestic pressures, colonial ambitions, and perceived slights from Western powers, the United States could appear distant, abstract. It was easy to think in terms of numbers on paper, harder to feel what those numbers meant in everyday life. Hiroshi was not a grand strategist, not a cabinet minister. He was one of many mid-level diplomats observing and reporting. But when he wrote home in carefully worded dispatches that passed through multiple hands before reaching Tokyo, he occasionally slipped in remarks about the physical environment. He might note that even junior officials in Washington seemed to live in houses larger than many senior bureaucrats in Tokyo. He might mention that modest American homes had rooms dedicated to leisure, that average floor space per person appeared generous. Such observations were not classified as hard intelligence, and they did not carry the weight of tonnage figures or fleet ratios. Yet they were clues to something crucial: the lived experience of a society that, if pushed into total war, could reallocate immense resources without reducing its population to the cramped conditions that were already normal elsewhere. Inside Japan, the same decades told a different story. Rapid industrialization, urban growth, and limited arable land all combined to keep housing relatively small. Even as cities rebuilt after disasters like the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, the underlying constraints of land area and population density remained. By the 1930s, Japan contained about one-third the population of the United States, in a landmass roughly 26 times smaller, a disparity that would continue to shape its housing patterns well into the future. From Hiroshi's vantage point in Washington, the contrast between his home country's careful, space-saving dwellings and America's spreading suburbs was impossible to miss. But it was not obvious whether anyone in Tokyo truly wanted to hear what these differences implied. War, memory, and the unspoken images. When war finally came first in China, then, after 1941, against the United States and its allies, Hiroshi was no longer in Washington. After relations collapsed and Japanese diplomats were interned and eventually repatriated, he found himself back in a homeland, moving rapidly into a state of total mobilization. The embassy compound he had known in Washington stood empty, its dignified brick halls quiet. In time, its ambassador and staff would be sent to internment camps, and the United States would not receive another Japanese ambassador until after the war. Hiroshi spent the war years in quieter assignments desk work in Tokyo, occasional trips to other Asian postings as the empire stretched thin. He was not a combatant. He did not stand on carrier decks or in jungle foxholes, but he, like millions of others, watched as news filtered in, early victories, then grinding campaigns, then a slow, relentless reversal. In Tokyo and other cities, housing, already compact, came under new strains. Bombing raids destroyed entire districts, families squeezed together in whatever remained standing. Later, when American incendiary attacks reached their full intensity, many of the wooden neighborhoods Hiroshi remembered from youth were reduced to ash. In those final, terrible months of the war, as food grew scarce and transportation broke down, the memory of those Washington small houses took on a bitter edge. He thought of the wide streets and detached homes, of the space between buildings that had seemed, at the time, almost extravagant. He imagined what American mobilization looked like inside those houses. Families sacrificing, yes, but from a starting point of far greater material comfort and space. After surrender, as Japan lay in ruins and Allied occupation forces spread out across the country, another layer of contrast emerged. American officers and administrators often lived in requisitioned Japanese houses or newly constructed dwellings that, even when labeled temporary or minimal, still reflected their own expectations of space. For ordinary Japanese citizens, many living in cramped emergency shelters or rebuilt shacks, these standard American quarters looked large. Hiroshi survived the war physically unscathed, but carrying a heavy sense of dissonance. He had seen American life up close before the conflict, and he had watched his own country commit to a fight whose material balance was badly tilted from the start. No one decision, no single house in Washington had caused that, but in his memory, the image of Americans calling such spacious dwellings small became a symbol for a broader misreading of the world Japan was entering. Quiet decades in shrinking rooms. In the years that followed, Hiroshi did what so many former officials did. He stepped quietly out of the center of events. Demobilization for him meant leaving government service as the ministry was reorganized under occupation oversight and then rebuilt in the new democratic state. He returned to a much smaller apartment in a recovering Japanese city where bomb damage, housing shortages, and tight land markets meant that post-war dwellings were often even more compact than pre-war ones. He married late, in his 40s, to a schoolteacher who had spent the war years evacuating children from cities threatened by air raids. They lived in a two-room flat with a tiny balcony, its layout a direct descendant of the space-saving traditions that had shaped Japanese housing for generations. The rooms doubled as bedroom, living room, and dining area depending on the time of day. Built-in storage swallowed bedding and cushions when they were not in use. Hiroshi rarely spoke of his years in Washington. His medals and service certificates, such as they were, stayed in a small box at the back of a closet. To his neighbors, he was simply a quiet, slightly formal man who worked for a trading company in a modest office job. He commuted on crowded trains, carried a briefcase, and spent his evenings reading newspapers squeezed into a chair by the window. As Japan rebuilt, it entered a new phase of rapid economic growth, what later came to be called the economic miracle. Factories that had once produced weapons were converted to consumer goods. Cities extended outward again, but on a far denser pattern than American suburbs. Apartment blocks rose, small detached houses filled tiny plots, and commuter railways funneled millions into urban centers each day. By the 1960s and 1970s, Japanese families enjoyed rising incomes and access to modern appliances, but average housing space remained constrained by land costs and population density. Hiroshi watched this transformation with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was proud Japan had survived catastrophe and found a way to prosper in peace. On the other, he occasionally wondered whether the country had ever truly confronted how badly it had misjudged its earlier climb into great power competition. In the evenings, when the television news showed images of American suburbs' wide streets, ranch houses, spacious lawns, those Washington memories flickered again in his mind. He did not join veterans groups or public campaigns. His war had been one of offices and reports, not trenches and gunfire. He felt that those who had fought and suffered physically were the ones whose stories mattered most, so he let his own experiences fade into the private space of family conversations, and even there he spoke sparingly. For his children, growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, their father's stories of Washington were distant and slightly unreal. He might mention the cherry blossoms along the Potomac, the shape of the Capitol dome, the broad avenues. Only occasionally did he return to the subject of houses. When he did, he would shake his head faintly and say something like, "They called them small." If stories like this matter to you, a like or a subscribe quietly tells the algorithm to show them to more people who don't want the human side of history to disappear. Historians, numbers, and the rediscovery of everyday power. Decades after Hiroshi's embassy years, scholars in both Japan and the United States began to pay closer attention not only to formal diplomacy, but to the cultural and social underpinnings of pre-war relations. They studied how each side viewed the other through lenses of modernity, tradition, race, and power. Within this broader field, the lived experience of diplomats gained new significance. Research into Japanese foreign service officers of the interwar period showed that many came from relatively privileged backgrounds, but even their privilege existed within a country where living space was far more limited than in America. At the same time, historians examining American society traced the steady growth of home sizes and the post-war explosion of suburban development. By the end of the 20th century, the average new American single-family home had roughly doubled in size since 1920, and the space available per person had more than quadrupled as household sizes shrank. Comparative studies of Japanese and American housing reinforced what men like Hiroshi had once felt intuitively. On average, American houses were about twice as large as Japanese ones, a difference rooted in land availability, settlement patterns, and cultural expectations. Japan, with far less land per person, had evolved an architecture of compactness, using design ingenuity to make small spaces livable and even beautiful. The United States, with abundant land and a cultural value placed on expansiveness, expressed its prosperity partly through sheer floor area. For diplomatic historians, these details were not trivial. They illuminated the everyday environment in which pre-war Japanese envoys formed their impressions of America. When an American host casually called a 1,000 or 200 square foot house small, he was speaking from within his own cultural frame, in which space was relatively cheap and expansion outward taken for granted. To a Japanese visitor whose country housed a large population in much smaller dwellings, that same house could feel like a statement of national scale. Documents from the period, including memoirs and diplomatic correspondence, show that many Japanese observers were struck by the physical amplitude of American life-wide streets, large cars, extensive shop displays, and, yes, roomy houses. Some commented on it explicitly. Others left only hints between the lines, references to comfortable living or spacious suburbs. The word small, when used by Americans to describe such spaces, appears occasionally in these accounts as a kind of cultural surprise. In reconstructing these experiences, historians have sometimes had to work like detectives. A passing remark in a diary might be cross-checked against census data on housing or against architectural histories of embassy neighborhoods. Patterns begin to emerge. Japanese diplomats posted to Washington or other American cities repeatedly encountered a scale of private living that exceeded what they knew at home. This did not automatically translate into accurate strategic assessments, but it did shape their sense of the society behind American policy. The irony is that many of these observations remained, in effect, stuck in small rooms. They were noticed by individuals, recorded in personal notes or minor reports, but they rarely became central to the high-level debates in Tokyo. The grand questions of empire, security, and prestige dominated. The quiet evidence of living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms did not carry decisive weight. A belated understanding, Hiroshi lived long enough to see scholarly interest turn toward the world he had once inhabited. In the 1980s and 1990s, younger researchers approached retired diplomats and officials seeking oral histories of the pre-war and wartime years. Some of his contemporaries agreed to interviews recounting their impressions of American society and the miscalculations that followed. He himself remained cautious, but when a researcher contacted him through a former colleague, he eventually agreed to a few conversations. Sitting in his small apartment with the city's newer high-rises peering over nearby rooftops, he answered questions about embassy routines, personalities, and impressions of American politics. At one point, the interviewer asked a more personal question. Beyond official duties, what struck him most about life in the United States? Hiroshi hesitated, then spoke of the first time he had heard a large American house described as small. He described the front porch, the wide hallway, the number of rooms. He talked about how, at the time, he had simply filed the memory away as curious a cultural difference in language. Only later, watching his own country press to the edge of exhaustion in a war it could not sustain, did he feel the full meaning of that word. The interviewer, trained in both history and economics, later connected Hiroshi's recollections with broader data on housing and living standards. In an article about how diplomats experienced foreign societies through everyday spaces, she quoted his story without using his real name as a striking example of how a single phrase could reveal an entire landscape of difference. By then, American and Japanese houses had evolved further, but the basic contrast remained. Japan continued to build compact dwellings, emphasizing efficiency and design, while American homes, on average, stayed significantly larger. Urbanization, aging populations, and changing family structures shaped new housing forms in both countries, yet the historical roots of their divergent paths could be traced back through decades of diplomatic visits, immigrant accounts, and statistical records. For Hiroshi, the recognition brought no medals, no ceremonies. His name did not appear in headlines. He had not saved a battalion on a battlefield or stopped a tank charge with a desperate act of courage. His contribution, if it could be called that, lay in the patient, almost invisible work of observation and noticing that what one country called small revealed something about the quiet foundations of its power, the quiet weight of ordinary rooms. There would be no White House ceremony for Hiroshi. No ribbon, no citation read out before cameras. The final recognition of his small role in the great drama of the 20th century came instead in footnotes and acknowledgments. In scholars' thanks for his willingness to recall a world that had vanished. If there is a kind of medal here, it is one shared by countless others: diplomats, attachés, interpreters, and clerks who lived in the shadows of big decisions and tried, in their own ways, to understand what they were seeing. They walked foreign streets, sat in foreign living rooms, and returned home with impressions that were sometimes heard and sometimes ignored. The distance between a small house in Washington and a crowded apartment in Tokyo is measured not only in square meters, but in assumptions: what a society considers normal, what it expects for its citizens, what it can draw upon in times of crisis. For Japanese diplomats in the interwar years, encountering American domestic space could be as shocking, in its quiet way, as any display of military hardware. Then, as now, our homes are archives of national history. Every wall and hallway says something about land, wealth, culture, and the long invisible preparations that sit behind a country's actions in the world. On that spring evening in 1937, as Hiroshi left the small house and stepped back into the cool Washington air, he likely did not know how long that image would stay with him. The car door closed, the sedan pulled away, and the house receded into the dark, one more quiet structure among many. Yet inside his memory, its rooms remained lit, a private record of how big small could be. Most of the history of the Second World War and the years that led into it was carried not only by generals and leaders, but by people like this, minor diplomats, clerks, and observers whose names are barely remembered if at all. They did not command armies, but they bore witness to the worlds those armies came from. Their stories remind us that the fate of nations can be glimpsed not only in war rooms and conferences, but in kitchens, hallways, and living rooms quietly described as nothing special. If you've watched this far, you're part of the small group of people who keep these quieter corners of history alive. If you feel like sharing, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family ever served abroad or lived between two cultures. Those stories, stacked together, are their own kind of archive one that helps make sure lives like Hiroshi's are not lost in the spaces between the big events.